The old Ford pickup was parked in the far corner of the secondary lot, its faded blue paint catching the last warm light of a November afternoon. Ethan Carter shut off the engine and stepped out, adjusting the cuffs of a clean flannel shirt before walking around to the passenger side. "Ready?" he asked. Sophie nodded and reached for his hand. She was 8 years old, serious beyond her years, with gray eyes that noticed everything and 2 uneven braids her father had struggled to finish before they left home. Ethan smiled apologetically at the braids. Sophie looked up at him. "They're fine. They're not even. Nobody will measure them." He laughed softly, and together they walked toward the annual fundraiser for Mission Children's Hospital. Inside, the ballroom glowed with polished brass, white tablecloths, and the quiet hum of money trying to sound humble. Waiters moved silently between tables. Along one wall stretched a silent auction filled with vacation packages, artwork, fishing trips, and luxury experiences. Near the front of the room stood Victoria Sterling, president of Sterling Motor Group, one of the most successful automotive companies in the Southeast. In less than 10 minutes, she would announce the opening of the company's newest North Carolina dealership. She wore a tailored navy dress and carried herself with the effortless confidence of someone who had spent her entire adult life being listened to. Beside her stood Richard Cole, her chief operating officer, and Thomas Grant, a longtime board member. Behind them, Claire Morgan held Victoria's coat over one arm while quietly reviewing the evening schedule. Claire rarely spoke unless necessary. She had learned years ago that people revealed more when they believed no one was listening. Victoria drifted toward the silent auction tables, only half paying attention to the items on display. She paused in front of a guided fishing excursion on the French Broad River and reached for the bidding pen. At the exact same moment, another hand reached for it from the opposite side of the table. She looked up. The man across from her was tall, weathered, and calm. For a brief second, their eyes met. Then he released the pen and stepped back without saying a word. Victoria took it. The man nodded politely and crossed the room toward a young girl standing beside the cocoa station. Victoria watched him for a moment longer than she intended before writing down a bid she did not actually care about. 5 minutes later, she stood beside an open window overlooking the parking area below. A warm breeze drifted through the ballroom. Richard leaned closer. "Thomas and I were discussing your demographic challenge." Victoria glanced sideways. "Oh?" Richard nodded toward the parking lot. "Look down there. Half those trucks are older than our interns." Thomas laughed politely. Victoria followed his gaze. At that exact moment, Ethan was helping Sophie climb into the cab of the old Ford. The truck's paint was faded. The chrome was worn. The vehicle looked completely out of place among the luxury SUVs and imported sedans surrounding it. Victoria smiled lightly. "Maybe step 1 of our marketing strategy should be teaching them what a sedan is." Thomas laughed harder. Richard grinned. The joke floated easily into the afternoon air. Down below, Ethan never looked up. He secured Sophie's seatbelt, brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, and closed the door. But Sophie had heard. She looked toward the window where the laughter had come from. Then she looked up at her father. Ethan squeezed her hand once. He said nothing. The gesture somehow carried more dignity than any response could have. Victoria's eyes met Sophie's for just a moment. The child looked at her directly. Not angry, not hurt, just aware. Something shifted inside Victoria. Only slightly, like a glass sliding a fraction of an inch across a tilted shelf. Not enough to fall, just enough to notice. "Victoria?" Richard said. She turned away. The moment disappeared, or so she thought. Several hours later, the fundraiser ended and the guests returned to their lives. At 6 o'clock that evening, Ethan stood barefoot on the porch of a modest cedar house outside Black Mountain, studying a weather station mounted near the railing. The equipment was far more sophisticated than anything that belonged on an ordinary front porch. Wind speed, pressure readings, radar data. His expression tightened. The storm was moving faster than expected, much faster. He pulled out his phone and studied a weather model for several seconds before dialing a number. "Jack," he said when the call connected. "The front's accelerating, 4 hours ahead of schedule." A pause. "Bring Sophie over," Jack replied immediately. "We'll keep the stove going. I'm on my way." Inside the house, Sophie was already pulling an overnight bag from her closet. "You knew?" Ethan asked. She shrugged. "You listened to the wind during breakfast." That was enough explanation for her. Ethan knelt and zipped her jacket. "Watch Batcave Road," she reminded him. "I always do." He kissed her forehead and carried the bag to the truck. Across town, Victoria was finishing a dinner she never wanted to attend. Richard had ordered another bottle of wine. Thomas was repeating a story he had already told twice that month. Victoria's phone vibrated. A message from Claire Morgan. "Miss Sterling, when convenient, I need to speak with you privately. It's important." Victoria read the message twice, then she set the phone face down. Outside, rain tapped softly against the restaurant windows. By 7:30, it had become steady. By 8, it rattled the glass. By 9, the storm had swallowed the mountains. Victoria finally pushed her chair back. "I'm leaving." Richard barely looked up. Thomas waved absently. Victoria stepped into the rain and hurried across the parking lot to her Tesla. The navigation system flashed a weather alert. Interstate delays. Alternative route recommended. Without thinking, she accepted the reroute. The car turned onto a winding mountain road. Miles away, Ethan hung a faded field jacket over his shoulders and climbed into the Ford. The cab lit up with weather displays, emergency radios, and communication equipment. Anyone seeing the truck from outside would have assumed it belonged to an ordinary working man. The inside told a very different story. He keyed the radio. Ethan Carter responding. Static crackled, then a familiar voice answered. "Commander Carter. That you? Civilian for 8 years, Marge." "Not tonight," Ethan smiled faintly. "Not tonight." Reports began flowing through the radio. Flooding, road closures, structural concerns, potential evacuations, a late-term pregnancy trapped near Old Fort, volunteer crews already mobilizing. Ethan shifted the truck into gear. Rain hammered the windshield. The old Ford rolled into the darkness. At nearly the same moment, Victoria's headlights illuminated something massive across the road ahead. An oak tree. It had fallen completely across both lanes. She slammed on the brakes. The Tesla stopped only a few feet from the trunk. Her heart pounded. She shifted into reverse. Nothing. While she had stopped, floodwater had already begun filling the low section of road behind her. The tires spun. The vehicle sank deeper. Warning lights flashed across the dashboard. Water crept higher around the wheels. Victoria stepped outside into rain falling nearly sideways. Within seconds she was soaked. Her phone showed no signal, no service, no help, no options. She climbed onto the hood and stared into the darkness. Then, through the curtain of rain, she saw 2 yellow headlights approaching slowly from behind. Steady, unhurried, confident. The lights belonged to the same old Ford pickup she had laughed at only hours earlier. Par deux. The old Ford pickup rolled to a stop beside the stranded Tesla. Rain hammered the roof so hard it sounded like gravel. For a moment, neither vehicle moved. Victoria Sterling stood on the hood of her car, soaked to the skin, staring through the darkness at the truck she recognized immediately. The faded blue paint. The worn chrome. The same truck she had laughed about only hours earlier. The driver's door opened. Ethan Carter stepped out into the storm wearing a weatherproof field jacket and carrying a flashlight. The beam swept across the flooded road, the fallen oak tree, and finally settled on Victoria. "Are you hurt?" he shouted over the wind. Victoria shook her head. The car's stuck. Ethan looked once at the rising water around the tires and nodded. "Yeah, I can see that." He moved closer, boots splashing through water already halfway to his knees. "Can you swim?" Victoria stared at him. "What? Can you swim?" "Yes." "Good. That makes this easier." Lightning flashed across the mountains, illuminating the entire valley in white light. For half a second, Victoria saw the situation clearly. The road behind her had disappeared beneath rushing water. The creek running parallel to the highway had overflowed its banks. Trees bent under violent wind. Then darkness returned. Ethan climbed onto the hood beside her. "Listen carefully. We have maybe 10 minutes before this road becomes a river." 10 minutes? Maybe less. Another flash of lightning lit the sky. Ethan studied the terrain around them. His expression remained calm, almost unnervingly calm. "Take my hand." Victoria hesitated, not because she doubted him, because she suddenly realized she trusted him completely. Ethan noticed the hesitation. "Miss Sterling." "Victoria, Victoria." His voice remained steady. "We need to move." She nodded and took his hand. The water was colder than she expected, the current stronger. Ethan guided her step by step toward the ford. When they reached the passenger side, he opened the door and helped her climb inside. The warmth of the cab hit her immediately. Victoria blinked in surprise. The interior looked nothing like the truck's exterior. Multiple radio units filled the dashboard. Digital weather displays glowed in different colors. Topographic maps were clipped beside the steering wheel. Emergency communication equipment occupied the center console. Victoria stared. "What is all this?" Ethan climbed behind the wheel. "Tools. For what?" Before he could answer, one of the radios crackled. "Command, this is Unit 7. We've lost access to Route 9. Repeat, Route 9 is gone." Ethan reached for the microphone. "Copy that. Redirect everyone south through Ridge Road. Avoid low crossings." Victoria looked at him. "Command?" Ethan shifted the truck into gear. Long story. Another radio came alive. "Pregnant female still trapped near Old Fort. Water's rising." Ethan answered immediately. "I'm 20 minutes out. You're responding personally?" "Yes." A pause followed. "Understood, Commander." The radio fell silent again. Victoria turned toward him. "Commander?" Ethan sighed softly. "Retired." "Retired from what?" "Search and rescue." "Search and rescue?" "Federal disaster response." "Before that, military emergency operations." Victoria stared at him. Every assumption she had made about him during the fundraiser began falling apart one by one. The truck pushed forward through sheets of rain. Water sprayed across the windshield. Ethan drove with quiet confidence, one hand on the wheel and one resting near the radio controls. "You knew this storm was coming," Victoria said. "Most people did." "Not like this." He glanced at her briefly. "No, not like this." For several miles neither spoke. Then another radio transmission interrupted the silence. "Community center roof failure. Approximately 40 occupants. Requesting immediate assistance." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Location? East Asheville Community Center." Ethan looked at the dashboard clock, then at the weather display, then at the flooded road ahead. He made a decision instantly. "I'm diverting." Victoria frowned. "What about the pregnant woman? Other teams are closer now." "And the community center?" "They're not." He turned the wheel sharply. The Ford left the main road and headed deeper into the storm. 20 minutes later, they arrived at a scene that looked like something from a disaster movie. Emergency lights flashed through the rain. Volunteers rushed between vehicles. Part of the community center roof had collapsed under the weight of fallen debris. Families stood outside wrapped in blankets. Children cried. Wind screamed around the building. Ethan stopped the truck before it had fully settled and was already opening the door. "Stay here," he told Victoria. She looked through the windshield. People were running in every direction. "I can help." Ethan studied her for a moment. Then he nodded once. "Can you follow instructions?" "Yes." "Good. Stay beside me." The next hour changed something inside Victoria Sterling forever. She watched Ethan move through chaos with absolute control. He organized volunteers, directed firefighters, coordinated evacuation routes, calmed frightened parents, assessed structural damage, solved problems before anyone else realized they existed. People listened when he spoke, not because of authority, not because of titles, because they trusted him. Victoria had spent years leading boardrooms. Ethan was leading a crisis. The difference was impossible to ignore. At one point, a terrified mother grabbed Ethan's arm. "My son's still inside." Ethan crouched to eye level. "What's his name?" "Connor." "How old?" 6. Ethan nodded calmly. "Okay, listen to me. We're going to find Connor." The woman's breathing slowed almost immediately. Somehow, she believed him. 10 minutes later, a rescue team emerged from the damaged section carrying a frightened little boy wrapped in a blanket. The mother broke down crying. Ethan simply nodded and moved on to the next problem. Near midnight, the worst of the storm finally began moving east. Rain softened from a roar to a steady rhythm. Exhausted volunteers gathered beneath temporary shelters. Victoria sat on the tailgate of the Ford wrapped in a borrowed blanket. Mud covered her shoes. Her hair was a disaster. For the first time in years, she had stopped caring what she looked like. Ethan approached carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to her. "Thanks, you earned it." She laughed quietly. "I handed out blankets." "You handed out a lot of blankets." Victoria stared into the steaming cup. "I owe you an apology." Ethan remained silent. For the fundraiser, the wind rattled a nearby road sign. And for the truck, Ethan finally smiled. "Annabelle doesn't care." "Annabelle?" "The truck." Victoria blinked. "You named your truck?" "My daughter named my truck." For the first time all night, Ethan laughed. A real laugh, warm, unforced. Victoria found herself smiling too. A few yards away, emergency crews continued working beneath floodlights. Beyond them, the mountains disappeared into darkness. The storm was moving away, but Victoria had the strange feeling that something much bigger had just begun. Par trois. By dawn, the storm had moved east, leaving behind a landscape that looked as though an angry giant had walked through the mountains during the night. Trees lay across roads. Power lines sagged. Entire sections of hillside had collapsed into muddy slopes. Emergency crews worked non-stop as helicopters began surveying the worst-hit areas. Ethan Carter had not slept. Victoria Sterling realized that only when she glanced at him shortly after sunrise and saw that he was still wearing the same field jacket from the night before. The difference was that everyone around him now seemed to know exactly who he was. Volunteers greeted him by name. Firefighters asked for his opinion before making decisions. Sheriff's deputies updated him before updating anyone else. Nobody called him Mr. Carter. Nobody called him Ethan. To most of them, he was simply Commander. The title carried no arrogance, only trust. Victoria sat on the tailgate of Annabelle, holding a paper cup that had long since gone cold. Her phone had finally regained service. Messages poured in faster than she could read them. Board members, investors, reporters. Richard Cole had left 7 voicemails. Thomas Grant had left 4. Claire Morgan had sent only one message. "Please call me as soon as you can. It's about Richard." Victoria stared at the text for several seconds before slipping the phone back into her pocket. For the first time in years, corporate problems felt strangely distant. A rescue helicopter thundered overhead. Ethan glanced up. "That's National Guard." Victoria followed his gaze. "How can you tell?" "Different rotor signature." She looked at him. "You can identify helicopters by sound?" "Most of them." Victoria laughed softly. "That's ridiculous." "Probably." Ethan didn't smile. He was already focused on the next problem. An hour later, they arrived at a small church that had been converted into a temporary shelter. Nearly 70 people crowded inside. Some had lost power, others had lost vehicles, a few had lost homes. Volunteers moved through the building carrying blankets and food. Ethan immediately disappeared into the crowd, checking generators, inspecting structural supports, and organizing supply deliveries. Victoria found herself helping without being asked. She distributed bottled water, carried boxes, helped elderly residents find seating. Nobody seemed to recognize her as the CEO of Sterling Motor Group. Nobody cared. For the first time in a very long time, she discovered what it felt like to enter a room without status. Shortly before noon, Claire Morgan arrived. Victoria spotted her stepping out of a mud-covered SUV near the church entrance. Claire looked exhausted. Her usually immaculate appearance had surrendered completely to the storm. "Claire," Victoria said. Claire walked directly toward her. "I've been trying to reach you for 12 hours. "I know." Claire glanced around the shelter before lowering her voice. "We have a problem." Victoria sighed. "Richard?" Claire nodded. "Richard." They stepped outside beneath the overhang near the church entrance. Rain still fell lightly. Claire removed a waterproof folder from her bag. 3 weeks ago, I started noticing irregularities. "What kind of irregularities?" "Land acquisitions." Victoria frowned. "For the dealership expansion?" "That's what Richard said." Claire handed her several documents. "They're not dealership acquisitions." Victoria flipped through the pages. Her expression slowly changed. These aren't company properties. No. They're private holdings. Yes. Owned by whom? Claire met her eyes. Richard. Silence followed. Victoria continued reading. The properties were located throughout western North Carolina. Several sat directly adjacent to future development zones Sterling Motor Group had been considering. Others bordered planned infrastructure projects. Insider information, Victoria said quietly. Claire nodded. At minimum. How much? Enough to interest federal investigators. Victoria closed the folder. The wind stirred around them. Does the board know? Not yet. Who else knows? Just me, Claire hesitated. And now you. For a long moment, Victoria said nothing. 12 months earlier, the revelation would have consumed her attention completely. Now, standing beside a church filled with displaced families, it felt different. Important? Certainly. Serious? Absolutely. But not more important than the people inside. The realization surprised her. Across the parking lot, Ethan was helping an elderly man into a wheelchair. Sophie sat nearby with several younger children gathered around her. She was explaining constellations using a flashlight and the church ceiling. The children listened as though she were revealing secrets of the universe. Victoria smiled despite herself. Claire followed her gaze. That's her? Sophie. And Ethan? Victoria nodded. Claire watched them quietly. Interesting. Victoria looked at her. What is? Claire smiled faintly. Nothing. Victoria knew that expression. Claire had spent 15 years observing people professionally. When she said nothing, she usually meant the exact opposite. That afternoon brought another emergency. A mudslide had cut off access to several homes on the far side of a ridge outside Asheville. One family remained trapped. Emergency vehicles couldn't reach them. Ethan gathered a small team within minutes. Victoria watched him study maps spread across the hood of Annabelle. You're going back out? She asked. Ethan looked up. Someone's waiting. The roads are still dangerous. I know. You've been awake for almost 30 hours. Probably. Probably? For the first time all day, Ethan smiled. I've lost track. Victoria folded her arms. That's not reassuring. It's not supposed to be. The rescue took nearly 5 hours. By the time Ethan returned, darkness had fallen again. Mud covered his boots. His jacket was torn near one shoulder. Exhaustion lined his face, but the trapped family had been evacuated safely. Victoria saw them climb from a rescue vehicle, 2 parents, a teenage son, and a frightened golden retriever. The dog immediately knocked Ethan backward while attempting to lick his face. For the first time all day, the entire rescue team laughed. Later that night, after most volunteers had finally found places to rest, Victoria and Ethan sat on the church steps overlooking the valley. The storm clouds had finally broken apart. Above them stretched a sky crowded with stars. Sophie slept inside beneath a pile of blankets. For a while neither spoke. The silence felt comfortable. Eventually Victoria looked toward the mountains. How many people have you rescued? Ethan considered the question. I don't know. Hundreds? Maybe. Thousands, he shrugged. Over enough years, numbers stop meaning much. Victoria studied him. And after all that, you became a mechanic? Ethan laughed quietly. Not exactly. Then why? He looked toward the stars. For several seconds, Victoria thought he might not answer. Finally, he spoke. Because one day I realized every emergency ends. And, after that, people still have to live. Victoria listened carefully. Ethan's eyes never left the sky. I spent 20 years arriving during the worst moments of people's lives. Then Rachel got sick. His voice softened at the mention of his wife. After she died, I stopped wanting to chase disasters. Silence settled between them, so I fixed engines, raised Sophie, tried to build something quieter. Victoria looked down at her hands. The simplicity of the answer affected her more than she expected. Across the valley, scattered lights flickered as power slowly returned to parts of the region. I don't think I've ever built anything quiet, she admitted. Ethan glanced at her. You could. Maybe. Definitely. Victoria laughed softly. You sound very certain. I am. The stars remained overhead. The mountains stood silent beyond the darkness. And for the first time in years, Victoria Sterling found herself wondering whether success and peace might not be opposites after all. Par quatre. The storm recovery effort continued for 3 more days. Roads reopened one section at a time. Power crews worked around the clock. Emergency shelters gradually emptied as families returned home or found temporary housing. By the 4th morning, Western North Carolina was exhausted but standing. Victoria Sterling finally returned to Charlotte. The city looked unchanged. Glass towers still reflected the morning sun. Luxury vehicles still filled parking garages. Assistants still hurried through lobbies carrying coffee and schedules. Yet everything felt different. She sat in the back of a company sedan on the way to headquarters and found herself staring out the window at ordinary people walking to work. A month earlier, she would have been reviewing quarterly reports. Today, she was thinking about volunteers carrying blankets through floodwater. Claire Morgan was waiting when Victoria arrived. The moment the office door closed, she placed a stack of documents on the desk. Richard knows. Victoria removed her coat. Knows what? That someone found the land records. Victoria sat down slowly. How? Because he started deleting emails at 3 o'clock this morning. Silence followed. Claire slid a tablet across the desk. Security footage filled the screen. Richard Cole entering executive records, storage after midnight. Richard leaving 40 minutes later, carrying 2 boxes. Richard returning alone. Victoria watched without speaking. Did he destroy anything? She finally asked. Not successfully. Claire's expression remained calm. I copied everything weeks ago. Victoria leaned back in her chair. Of course you did. You pay me to anticipate problems. Remind me to give you a raise. Claire almost smiled. By noon, an emergency board meeting had been scheduled. Richard arrived looking confident. Thomas Grant arrived looking confused. The remaining directors appeared mostly irritated at being called in with such little notice. Victoria sat quietly at the head of the table while Claire distributed folders. Richard noticed the folders immediately. His confidence faded almost imperceptibly. Victoria, he began, before we start, I'd like to discuss the public relations opportunities created by your storm response. We'll get there, Victoria replied. First, I'd like to discuss real estate. The room grew quiet. Richard stopped speaking. Claire opened the first folder. Documents slid across polished wood. Property records, corporate filings, internal emails, financial transfers. Every page told the same story. By the time the final document had been reviewed, nobody in the room looked surprised anymore, only disappointed. Richard attempted 3 different explanations. None survived more than 5 minutes. Eventually, he stopped talking altogether. Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes. Richard, he said quietly, how long? Richard stared at the table. 3 years. Nobody spoke. 3 years. 3 years of using confidential company information for personal gain. 3 years of manipulating decisions that affected thousands of employees. 3 years of betrayal hidden behind polished presentations and expensive suits. Victoria watched him carefully. Strangely, she felt no satisfaction, only sadness. The vote to remove Richard was unanimous. When the meeting ended, Richard remained seated while everyone else stood. Victoria. She paused near the door. What? You got lucky. The room fell silent again. Richard looked directly at her. A storm stranded you on a mountain road and suddenly you're a different person. Victoria considered that. Then she shook her head. No. Her voice remained calm. The storm just showed me who I already was. Richard laughed bitterly. And who is that? Victoria thought of Sophie explaining constellations. She thought of exhausted volunteers carrying supplies through mud. She thought of Ethan standing in the rain while everyone else waited for instructions. Someone's still learning, she said. Then she walked out. That evening, she drove west. No assistance, no security, no corporate vehicle, just Victoria behind the wheel of her own car. The mountains greeted her with fading sunlight and long shadows stretching across winding roads. By the time she reached Black Mountain, dusk had settled over the valley. She followed directions Claire had somehow obtained without explanation. A narrow gravel road climbed through a stand of pine trees before ending near a modest cedar house. Annabelle sat in the driveway. Victoria smiled before she realized she was smiling. The porch light was on. She climbed the steps and knocked. A moment later, the door opened. Sophie stood there holding a book. "Hi," the little girl said. "Hi. You found us." "I think so." Sophie considered this carefully. "Dad," she shouted over her shoulder. "The CEO is here." "From somewhere inside the house," Ethan's voice answered. "That's usually not how we introduce guests." A few seconds later, he appeared in the hallway. For a brief moment, neither spoke. Then Ethan looked toward the driveway. "You drove yourself?" "Yes." "That's a long drive." "Yes." "Everything okay?" Victoria nodded. "Richard's gone." Ethan studied her face. "And?" Victoria exhaled slowly. "And I didn't know who else to tell first." Something softened in Ethan's expression. Not surprise, not approval, recognition, as though he understood exactly how difficult that admission had been. "Well," he said, stepping aside, "you should probably come in." The house smelled like coffee and wood smoke. Books lined one wall. Maps covered another. A telescope stood near the living room window. Sophie returned to her spot on the couch and resumed reading, as though CEOs arrived unexpectedly every day. Victoria sat at the kitchen table while Ethan poured coffee. For a while they talked about nothing important: road repairs, weather forecasts, a broken generator at the community shelter. The conversation felt strangely easy. Eventually Victoria looked around the room. "It's peaceful here." Ethan followed her gaze. "Most days. You ever miss it?" "Miss what?" "The big emergencies." He shook his head. "No. Not even a little?" Ethan smiled. "I miss the people, not the disasters." The answer lingered between them. Outside, the mountains disappeared into darkness. Inside, the kitchen remained warm. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Victoria realized she was not thinking about quarterly earnings, shareholder expectations, or expansion strategies. She was thinking about whether she wanted another cup of coffee. The realization felt almost revolutionary. Sophie eventually looked up from her book. "Dad? Yeah? Can Victoria stay for dinner?" Victoria nearly laughed. Ethan looked toward the stove, then back at Victoria. "That's actually up to Victoria." For the first time in years, no board member, investor, or executive was waiting for her answer. Only an 8-year-old girl. Victoria smiled. "I'd like that." Outside, the last traces of the storm had finally disappeared beyond the horizon. Bar 5. Victoria ended up staying far longer than she intended. Dinner stretched into coffee. Coffee stretched into conversation. Conversation stretched into something she had not experienced in years. A night where nobody wanted anything from her. Sophie talked about stars, meteor showers, and a science competition she hoped to enter in the spring. Ethan listened while washing dishes. Occasionally he corrected a date or a fact, but mostly he allowed Sophie to tell the story her own way. Victoria found herself smiling more than she spoke. When she finally checked the time, it was nearly 11 o'clock. "I should probably go," she said. Sophie frowned immediately. "Already?" Victoria laughed. "Some of us have jobs. Dad has a job. Your dad has about 6 jobs." Ethan shook his head. "That's probably fair." Sophie considered this and nodded seriously. "You can come back next weekend." Victoria looked toward Ethan. "Was that an invitation?" "Apparently." "Good," Sophie said, "because I already decided." The drive back to Charlotte felt shorter than the drive there. Victoria could not explain why. The following Monday, something unusual happened at Sterling Motor Group. Employees began noticing changes. Small changes at first. Executive parking spaces closest to the building disappeared. The company cafeteria expanded its employee meal program. Victoria started spending time on manufacturing floors instead of remaining exclusively in boardrooms. She listened more, interrupted less. One regional manager later described the transformation as watching someone remove armor they had forgotten they were wearing. The changes spread through the company. Morale improved. Productivity increased. Investors approved. Nobody understood the full reason. Victoria did. 3 weeks later, Ethan received a phone call while repairing a transmission at his garage. The number belonged to Washington, D.C. He almost ignored it. Almost. Mr. Carter? Speaking. This is Deputy Director Helen Brooks with the Federal Emergency Preparedness Agency. Ethan closed his eyes. That sounds official. It is. Then I'm already worried. The woman laughed softly. Good. That means your reputation is accurate. Ethan leaned against the workbench. What can I do for you? We'd like you to consider joining a national advisory task force. Ethan stared at the garage ceiling. No, you didn't even hear the details. I've had experience with government committees. This one would matter. They all say that. This one actually would. Ethan rubbed the bridge of his nose. I'll think about it. That's all I'm asking. After the call ended, he stood quietly for several moments. Then he returned to work. Unfortunately, Sophie overheard enough of the conversation to become curious. That evening, she sat across from him at the kitchen table. You're thinking about saying no? Ethan looked up from his coffee. Probably. You always say no. Not always. Most of the time. Ethan could not argue with that. Sophie folded her arms. Mom used to say helping one person is good, but helping 1,000 people is also good. Ethan smiled faintly. Rachel had indeed said that. Sophie continued. If they need you, maybe you should help. Ethan stared at his daughter. Sometimes she sounded so much like Rachel that it felt unfair. I'll think about it, he said again. Sophie nodded. Good. Then she returned to her homework, apparently satisfied she had solved the problem. A few days later, Victoria arrived in Black Mountain carrying 2 boxes of pizza and a telescope lens she had ordered for Sophie. Bribery, Ethan observed. Strategic relationship management, Victoria corrected. Sophie immediately took Victoria's side. Ethan claimed this was because of the telescope lens. Sophie insisted it was because Victoria was obviously right. The argument lasted 15 minutes and ended with all 3 of them laughing. Later that night, after Sophie had gone to bed, Victoria and Ethan sat on the porch overlooking the mountains. A cold breeze drifted through the trees. You're different, Ethan said. Victoria looked at him. Good different or bad different? Definitely good. That's reassuring. Ethan stared out into the darkness. You know, most people don't change. Maybe they do. Not usually. Victoria thought about that. Maybe most people never meet the right teacher. Ethan glanced sideways at her. And who was yours? Victoria smiled. An old Ford pickup. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then he laughed harder than she had ever heard before. Winter arrived quietly. Christmas lights appeared throughout Black Mountain. Snow dusted the higher elevations. The advisory task force continued calling Ethan. He continued avoiding a final answer. Meanwhile, Victoria spent more weekends in the mountains than in Charlotte. The board noticed. Claire noticed. Sophie definitely noticed. One Saturday afternoon, while Ethan was outside repairing a fence, Sophie sat beside Victoria on the couch. Can I ask something? Of course. Do you like my dad? Victoria nearly dropped her coffee. Sophie waited patiently. That's a very direct question. Dad says direct questions save time. Victoria made a mental note to have a conversation with Ethan. Your father is one of my favorite people. Sophie nodded. Okay. Okay? That's all I wanted to know. Victoria narrowed her eyes suspiciously. I don't believe you. Sophie smiled. You're getting better at reading people. Then she returned to her book. The answer finally came in January. Ethan accepted the advisory position. Not because of Washington, not because of prestige, not because of recognition. He accepted because Sophie was right. If he had knowledge that could help protect communities before disasters happened, then refusing to share it felt selfish. The announcement received national attention. News outlets requested interviews. Ethan declined nearly all of them. One reporter managed to ask why he accepted. His answer appeared in newspapers across the country. Preparedness isn't about surviving storms, he said. It's about making sure fewer people have to. Victoria clipped the article and kept it in her desk drawer. In March, the governor of North Carolina announced a statewide recognition ceremony honoring emergency volunteers who had responded during the historic storm. Hundreds attended: firefighters, paramedics, search teams, National Guard personnel, community volunteers. Ethan sat near the back and hoped not to be noticed. The plan failed immediately. His name was called last. The standing ovation began before he reached the stage. Ethan looked uncomfortable the entire time. Victoria found this deeply amusing. Sophie found it hilarious. When the ceremony ended, reporters surrounded him. He escaped by pretending to need help carrying folding chairs. The strategy worked surprisingly well. Later that evening, the three of them stopped at a scenic overlook on the drive home. The mountains stretched toward the horizon beneath a sky filled with stars. Sophie leaned against the guardrail studying the constellations. Victoria stood beside Ethan. Neither spoke for a while. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "You know, a year ago, if someone had told me I'd spend my weekends with a CEO, I would have laughed." Victoria smiled. "A year ago, if someone had told me I'd be spending mine with a mechanic, I would have laughed too." "Mechanic?" Ethan raised an eyebrow. "Search and rescue commander, disaster expert, national advisor, single father, amateur philosopher, occasional mechanic. That's a long business card. You should see yours." They laughed together. Below them, the lights of distant towns shimmered across the valley. Above them, the stars remained unchanged. And standing there beneath that endless sky, both of them understood something neither had expected when this story began. The storm had not ruined their lives. It had quietly led them home. Parsis. Spring arrived slowly in the mountains. The last traces of winter disappeared from the higher elevations. Wildflowers returned to the valleys, and the forests around Black Mountain transformed into endless shades of green. Life settled into a rhythm neither Victoria Sterling nor Ethan Carter had planned, but both quietly appreciated. During the week, Victoria ran Sterling Motor Group with a confidence that felt different from before. She no longer measured success solely by expansion reports, quarterly earnings, or shareholder approval. Employees noticed it. Managers noticed it. Even investors noticed it. The company continued growing, but for the first time, people seemed just as important as profits. Claire Morgan once described the transformation during a board meeting by saying, "The company stopped feeling like a machine and started feeling like a community." Victoria never admitted how much that compliment meant to her. Ethan, meanwhile, spent part of each month advising emergency preparedness teams around the country. He traveled more than he wanted to, but less than Washington preferred. Every time he left, Sophie kept a countdown calendar on the refrigerator. Every time he returned, she crossed off the final day with dramatic celebration. No matter where he traveled, he always came home to the same cedar house, the same mountains, and the same old Ford pickup sitting faithfully in the driveway. Annabelle had become something of a local legend. Several magazines requested photographs of the truck. Ethan refused every request. Sophie found this hilarious. "The truck is more famous than you," she told him one morning. "That's because the truck has a better personality," Ethan replied. One Saturday in early May, Victoria arrived carrying breakfast instead of dinner. She walked into the house balancing a tray of coffee and pastries. Sophie immediately narrowed her eyes. "What did you do?" Victoria blinked. "Excuse me? You only bring pastries when you're nervous." Ethan laughed so hard he nearly dropped his coffee. Victoria pointed accusingly at him. "You told her that?" "I didn't have to." Sophie grinned. "I figured it out myself." Victoria shook her head. "This family is impossible." "And yet you keep showing up," Ethan said. The observation lingered in the room. Victoria opened her mouth, closed it again, and then looked suspiciously interested in a blueberry muffin. Sophie smiled quietly and returned to her astronomy book. A month later, Sterling Motor Group opened its newest dealership. The event attracted media coverage, local officials, and several hundred guests. 1 year earlier, Victoria would have stood alone at the podium delivering a carefully rehearsed speech. This time she did something different. Halfway through her remarks, she paused and invited several employees onto the stage: mechanics, service technicians, receptionists, managers, people who normally remained invisible during corporate celebrations. Reporters later described it as the most unusual dealership opening they had ever covered. Employees described it differently. They described it as the moment they realized the company truly had changed. After the ceremony ended, Victoria slipped away from the crowd and checked her phone. A text message from Sophie waited for her. "Did you remember to eat lunch?" Victoria laughed out loud. Several reporters looked confused. She texted back immediately. "Yes." "Did you remember your science project?" The reply arrived less than 10 seconds later. "Maybe." Victoria suspected that meant no. Summer brought long evenings and clear skies. One Friday night, the three of them sat on the porch, watching fireflies drift through the darkness. Sophie had positioned a telescope in the yard and was attempting to explain planetary motion using a combination of scientific terminology and wild hand gestures. Ethan listened patiently. Victoria pretended to understand everything. "You're bluffing," Sophie announced. Victoria looked offended. "I am not." "You absolutely are." "How can you tell?" Sophie pointed. "You nodded when I said retrograde motion, but your eyes looked confused." Ethan nearly choked on his coffee. Victoria covered her face with both hands. "I cannot believe I'm being interrogated by a 9-year-old. Almost 10, Sophie corrected. "That makes it worse." As autumn approached, another ceremony was announced. This one was smaller, more personal. The town council of Black Mountain wanted to recognize local volunteers who had helped save lives during the historic storm. Ethan immediately attempted to avoid attending. The strategy failed when Sophie and Victoria joined forces against him. The ceremony took place on a cool October evening beneath strings of lights stretched across the town square. Families gathered, children played near the fountain. Local musicians performed on a small stage. When Ethan's name was called, the applause seemed to come from every direction at once. He accepted the plaque with visible discomfort. Then the mayor invited him to say a few words. Ethan looked as though he would rather face another hurricane. Eventually, he stepped toward the microphone. "I don't really deserve this," he began. Groans immediately rose from the audience. Sophie rolled her eyes dramatically. Even Victoria laughed. Ethan smiled despite himself. "Okay, maybe that's not the right way to start. What I mean is this. Nobody gets through difficult times alone. Not storms, not grief, not mistakes, not life. Every person standing here tonight helped someone else when it mattered. That's the only reason any of us are here." The crowd fell quiet. People like to talk about heroes. I've never been comfortable with that word. Most of the time, helping someone is smaller than people think. Sometimes it's carrying supplies through floodwater. Sometimes it's checking on a neighbor. Sometimes it's offering someone a second chance when they don't think they deserve one. Those things matter more than we realize. His eyes briefly found Victoria in the crowd. "At least, that's what I've learned." The applause lasted much longer than the speech. Later that evening, after the event ended and the crowd dispersed, the three of them walked back toward Annabelle beneath a sky filled with stars. The air carried the first hint of approaching winter. Sophie walked several steps ahead, pointing out constellations. Victoria and Ethan followed behind. "You know," Victoria said quietly, "if someone had told me a year ago that getting stranded in a flood would become the best thing that ever happened to me, I would have thought they were insane." Ethan smiled. "I probably would have agreed. And yet here we are. Here we are." For a moment neither spoke. The town lights glowed softly behind them. The mountains stood dark against the horizon. Sophie suddenly turned around. "Are you two coming?" "We're right behind you," Ethan called. "You're slow." "That's because we're old," Victoria replied. Sophie considered this. "Fair point." Then she continued toward the truck. When they reached Annabelle, Ethan opened the passenger door. Victoria looked at him. "You know, this entire story started because I laughed at this truck." Ethan glanced at the faded blue paint. "The truck forgave you." "That's very generous of the truck. She's remarkably mature." Victoria shook her head. "I still can't believe you named it." "I didn't. Technically I did," Sophie shouted from the back seat. "And it was a great decision." Ethan pointed toward his daughter. "See? Expert opinion." Victoria laughed and climbed inside. The truck rolled down the mountain road beneath a sky crowded with stars. Ahead of them stretched miles of winding pavement and the warm lights of home waiting in the distance. A year earlier, Victoria Sterling had measured her life through success, status, and control. Ethan Carter had measured his through responsibility, sacrifice, and survival. Neither had expected a storm to rearrange everything, yet somehow it had, not by destroying what mattered, but by revealing it. And as Annabelle disappeared into the quiet Carolina night carrying a former CEO obsessed with achievement, a man who had spent his life helping others, and a little girl who understood the stars better than most adults ever would, it became clear that the most important journeys rarely begin when everything goes right. They begin when life forces us onto a different road and we discover, somewhere along the way, exactly where we were meant to be all along.